Welcome to the deep dive. Today, today we're going to be looking at how teachers can guide student learning in a really fascinating but often chaotic world.
Yeah.
We're talking about computer-supported collaborative learning, or CSCL.
Right.
So picture this, right? A classroom bustling with students. They're working together on a science project using digital tools, brainstorming ideas. This is CSCL in action. And we're going to take a deep dive into an academic paper today from the journal Science Education to try to understand the really crucial and often overlooked role of the teacher in this setting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, it's kind of like being a conductor, leading an orchestra. You've got all this science content. You've got the students bouncing ideas off of each other in these powerful digital tools. And they all need to be kind of brought together to create this harmonious learning experience.
Okay, so our source material today is this study called Exploring Teacher Intervention in the Intersection of Digital Resources, Peer Collaboration, and Instructional Design. And to set the scene a little bit, the study was about these high school students who were using a computer environment called the SCY Lab. And it's basically like a virtual science lab with these different modules where they can explore different scientific concepts.
Right.
In this case, they were designing a CO2-friendly house.
Right.
Which sounds pretty cool, right?
Yeah, you know, designing one of these houses, it means that the students really have to grapple with this concept of heat loss and how heat loss is affected by all these different materials. But what's really intriguing here is that truly understanding heat loss, it requires two very different ways of thinking. And it's kind of like the difference between just experiencing something and actually being able to calculate it, put a number on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, I totally get that if I wear like a thick winter coat.
Yeah.
I'm going to be much warmer than if I just wear a thin jacket.
Yeah.
But I have no idea how to calculate exactly how much heat each of those coats is preventing from escaping my body.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about this. The researchers call these two different ways of thinking, the phenomenon perspective and the formula perspective. So you need both of these to really grasp complex concepts like this. The phenomenon perspective, that's all about your real world experience. Like if you touch a hot stove,
right,
you immediately understand, right, that metal conducts heat really well.
Right.
But then to actually like design a truly energy efficient house, you also need that formula perspective.
Yeah.
You need to understand and be able to apply concepts like the heat transfer coefficient.
Okay, so can you explain heat transfer coefficient to me like I'm 5?
Sure. So imagine your winter coat again, a high heat transfer coefficient. That's kind of like wearing a thin coat. It lets the heat escape really easily, but then a low heat transfer coefficient, that's like wearing that thick, puffy coat. You're going to stay nice and toasty warm. So basically, the heat transfer coefficient, it's just telling you how easily heat can pass through different materials.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so in this study, the students were tackling these concepts in groups using something called the jigsaw method. I've heard of this before. I think it's where each student becomes like an expert on one particular topic.
Yeah.
And then they teach it to their peers. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And this method, this jigsaw method, it's definitely promising, but it has actually produced kind of mixed results in the past. So sometimes it leads to deeper understanding, but then other times it can lead to some confusion, especially if those expert students aren't really quite ready for that teacher role. And that's what makes the role of the actual teacher in the classroom even more fascinating in this kind of scenario.
Right. So how did the teachers navigate this super complex environment where they had to balance guiding the students without undermining their roles as these experts in their groups?
Well, to try to understand that dynamic, the researchers, they zeroed in on two specific groups of students.
Okay.
And they were chosen because they were particularly talkative. And their interactions with the teacher, they revealed some really insightful patterns.
Okay, so let's start with Amanda's group. So she was the designated expert on heat transfer. Did she do a good job?
Well, Amanda felt really confident in her own understanding of heat transfer coefficient. But she actually stumbled a little bit when it came to explaining it clearly to the other students in her group. And then, of course, the teacher stepped in, which added this whole new layer of complexity.
Oh, I can imagine. He's trying to figure out if they understand. But at the same time, he doesn't want to make Amanda feel like he's questioning her expertise. It's a good situation.
Yeah, it's a very tricky situation. And there's this one moment that perfectly highlights this delicate dance. So, one of Amanda's group members, a student named Ollie, Ali gets confused about whether steel, with its high heat transfer coefficient, would actually be better for insulation than wood, which has a low coefficient. And it's a common misconception, thinking that a high number automatically means better.
Yeah, I've definitely been there. So how did the teacher handle this? Did he just like jump in and tell them what's what?
Interestingly enough, no, he didn't just give them the answer. He actually used this really clever real-world analogy. He asked the students to imagine touching a hot nail versus a matchstick, and both the nail and the matchstick are made of wood. He asked them which one would burn them faster.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good analogy. Did it work? Did Ollie get it?
It did. It totally clicked for her. And what's fascinating is that even though Amanda kind of struggled at the beginning, her group actually eventually gravitated towards that more formula perspective in their final presentation. So they end up focusing on those heat transfer coefficients and the calculations. So it seems like the teacher's intervention, and particularly that analogy, really pushed their thinking beyond just, the experience of heat and cold.
That's really interesting. Okay, so that's one group down. What about the second group, Isabel's group? Did they follow kind of a similar path?
This is where it gets really interesting because Isabel's group took a completely different approach. So Amanda's group, they were really into the numbers and the formulas, but Isabel's group, they really stuck with that phenomenon perspective. So their understanding of heat transfer was much more about experiencing and observing things.
So they focused more on like feeling the heat, so to speak.
Yes.
What kind of challenges did that create?
Well, Isabel, she was an expert in her group. And she explained heat transfer mostly in terms of insulation acting like a barrier to the wind, which isn't entirely wrong, but it's kind of like describing a car as just a thing with wheels.
Right, you're missing a lot of the important details.
Exactly. And one of her group members, a student named Mary, she actually called her out on this. She asked a really, really brilliant question. She said, okay, but does insulation actually warm up the cold air that's entering a house?
That is a great question.
Right.
And it really shows like the limitations of only relying on that phenomenon perspective. So did Isabel have a good answer?
Not really. She struggled to explain it clearly, and the whole group actually started to get kind of frustrated because they couldn't really resolve this point.
Okay.
And what's really interesting here is that the teacher was present for all of this. He was watching this whole discussion unfold, but he didn't step in. He didn't directly step in to correct this misconception.
I guess he was trying to give them space to figure it out on their own. But did their understanding actually improve?
Not really, unfortunately. They ended up just moving on without fully grasping the concept. And that's one of the real pitfalls, I think, of collaborative learning. Without the proper guidance, these misconceptions can take root and they can spread.
Right.
And this really highlights that tightrope that teachers have to walk in this kind of CSCL environment. On the one hand, you want to encourage the students. You want them to collaborate. You want them to figure things out on their own. But on the other hand, you need to be ready to step in and provide guidance when they're heading down the wrong path.
Absolutely. So how did all of this play out in their final presentation for Isabel's group?
Well, unlike Amanda's group, who really embraced those formulas and those numbers, Isabel's group, they pretty much stuck to that phenomenon understanding. So they presented their design for their CO2 friendly house, but they didn't really get into the detail, the nitty gritty of the calculations and the heat transfer coefficients.
So we had these two groups, both trying to learn the same concept, but ending up with very, very different levels of understanding. What can we take away from this?
It really underscores the fact that technology, while it's very powerful, it can't replace a skilled teacher. In this study, the students had access to a sophisticated virtual lab, this SCY lab, that was designed to help them explore heat loss. But both groups still needed that guidance from the teacher to really grasp the concepts and to be able to apply them to their design challenge.
It's like, it's like having all the ingredients for a gourmet meal.
Yeah.
But you don't know how to combine them. Actually create something delicious.
Exactly.
You need that chef.
Yeah, need that chef in the kitchen. And that's where the teacher's expertise really comes in. They're not just there to provide information. They're there to translate that information into actual understanding.
Yeah.
They're the ones who ask the right questions. They come up with those insightful analogies, and they make sure that the students are actually connecting the dots.
This actually reminds me of something we touched on a little bit earlier. The teacher in this study was very, very cautious about not undermining those expert students, even when those students were clearly struggling. Do you think that that hands-off approach had an impact on the outcome?
I think it's definitely a factor to consider. While empowering the students is absolutely crucial, this study does seem to suggest that teachers also need to find ways to assess, how much each individual student actually understands within those group dynamics.
Right.
So prompting the students to explain their thinking is a good first step. But sometimes, you need to probe a little deeper. You need to uncover those misconceptions that might be hiding beneath the surface.
It sounds like teaching in this kind of CSCL environment requires a very specific set of skills.
Absolutely.
You need to be comfortable with the technology.
Right.
You need to understand the group dynamics.
Yeah.
And you need to be able to seamlessly switch between being a facilitator and a guide and an instructor.
It's definitely not one size fits all.
Yeah.
But when it's done well, CSCL can create truly engaging and effective learning experiences.
So for those of you listening in, think back to your own experiences learning challenging concepts. Did you lean more towards that phenomenon perspective, that kind of intuitive experiential understanding, or did you lean more towards the formula perspective, where you break things down and you analyze them?
Yeah, and more importantly, how can teachers do a better job of bridging that gap? In today's really tech-driven classrooms, how can we make sure that students aren't just, using the tools, but that they're actually understanding the concepts that are behind them?
That is definitely something to think about. As we continue to explore this ever-evolving world of education, this has been a really, really fascinating deep dive into the complexities of teaching and learning in a CSCL setting. It seems like whenever we talk about the future of education, we always end up focusing on the technology itself. But what this study really shows is that it's not about the tools. It's about how we actually use those tools.
Right. It's about having that skilled guide, that facilitator, someone who can help the students navigate all this complexity.
Someone who understands, the power of collaboration, but also recognizes when they need to step in and provide some support, when they need to be more hands-on.
Yeah.
So it's not just about throwing a bunch of technology into the classroom and hoping for the best. It's about empowering teachers to use those tools in a really effective way, to orchestrate these learning experiences that actually benefit students.
Yeah. And maybe most importantly, it's about recognizing that teaching and learning, they're always evolving. We're always discovering new ways to engage students, to help them make those connections, to spark that joy of discovery.
So what are some of the practical takeaways from this deep dive? What can teachers, or even just anyone who's passionate about learning, what could they do to make the most of CSCL?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that learning isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right.
Some people, they gravitate more towards that hands-on experiential phenomenon perspective. And then other people, they really thrive on that formula approach. They want to break things down and analyze them.
And the key is finding that balance, finding a way to bridge those two perspectives, to help students see how, the real world connects to these abstract ideas.
Exactly. And that's where the role of the teacher is just so important. They can come up with those really insightful analogies. They can ask those probing questions that make students think more deeply. They can challenge assumptions, and they can encourage their students to move beyond just surface level understanding.
It's about fostering that sense of curiosity, that desire to dig deeper, to ask why, and not to be satisfied with just knowing the what's.
And that's something we can all do, whether we're teachers or students or just lifelong learners. We can embrace that sense of wonder. We can challenge ourselves to explore new perspectives and never stop asking questions.
That's what makes taking a deep dive like this so rewarding. It's about going beyond just the headlines, digging into the research, and uncovering those little insights that can really change the way we think about the world.
And hopefully, along the way, we discover something new about ourselves, about how we learn, and about how we can help others learn more effectively.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of CSCL, we'll leave you with this final thought. Don't be afraid to experiment, to try new things, to push the boundaries of your own understanding.
And remember, the best learning experiences often happen when we step outside our comfort zones, when we collaborate with others, and when we have a skilled guide to help us navigate the unknown.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.